Hey, what's up, everybody? Just getting set up. We'll go start in just a second. Seeing if I could get chat to show up in here. Look at that. All right, hopefully that doesn't go terribly wrong. All right, I'm gonna give people just a second to hop in, and I'm gonna take a drink, and then we'll get started. Hello out there, everybody. Let's see. That's weird. Why did my chat disappear? Oh, there it goes. All right. I just need to pull up one more thing. So I set up a form where you can just pre-submit some questions if anybody has questions. I'm going to talk about crunching and building MMOs today. So if you guys have questions specifically about those, I'm going to try to hit those first, kind of the biggest thing. And it'll probably be on for, I don't know, maybe an hour or so. We'll just chat about these things. But first I wanted to talk about crunching once I pull up my crunching Google spreadsheet that I put together. Or it's the form, actually. I don't have my spreadsheet ready. Whatever. We're just going to go through it because I was kind of curious to see what people replied to in the form. So here, let's switch to a desktop view for a moment. By the way, I see people talking about the panels in the background. If you're curious about them, they're just LifeX panels. Multiple people have asked about them in the past. They're really cool. They're on sale for Black Friday, so I got 2 packs of them, and they do all kinds of cool little different animations. So you can see right now they're in that morph mode, and if I go into the little app on my phone, we can change them to, let's see if I can get fire to work. Fire mode. So that, see the bottom one now is like supposed to look like a fire, and you can adjust this and all that. Yeah, this will be recorded. So if you're curious, you're watching it now and you just don't have time, you got to go watch the Super Bowl or something else. Feel free. You'll be able to come back and check it later. If you have questions, just drop them in that form down below. You can go through like a color cycle mode. There are a bunch of different cool things you can do with these things. That one didn't work right at all. The app is a little bit confusing. They've changed it and stuff, but let's just put it back on morph for now. There we go. So anyway, yeah, if you're interested in those, they're just LifeX panels. You can find them on the internet everywhere. Let me turn down the brightness of that one because it cranked up way too high. That's this one, I think. And turn it way, way down. That's a weird thing with these panels. I have to turn them to like 30% or less usually to get them to show up here. Otherwise, they wash out. All right, so let's talk about crunching and get started. So I sent out a survey a couple days ago just trying to get an idea of how many people crunch and how bad it is for everyone else. Because in my experience, crunching has been somewhat of an optional thing 95% of the time. So most of the time when I see people crunching, or I've known people who are crunching, it was because either they wanted to improve the quality of something that they didn't feel they had enough time to improve the quality of, or they just had fallen way behind on their work. On rare occasions, though, which is interesting here because that's what I see right here, the rare occasion one got 54% for how often people have to crunch. On rare occasions, like the entire team or subsets of the team would need to do some sort of crunching, and it would usually be short term. This would be like, a day, 2 days, maybe even like a week right before we're doing a big launch, a big demo or something else, and everybody's just kind of working hardcore crazy overtime because they're going towards something that they consider to be a make or break type event, right? It's a thing where if this goes wrong, it's going to cause long-term problems for everybody, so we want to all make sure that it doesn't go wrong. The interesting part for me was the 10%-ish of people who marked all the time, or 9.4%. That sounds miserable and like something that I don't personally know anybody who's been in that scenario for very long. I've heard some horror stories from maybe 20 20 plus years ago, where people were working nonstop, 70, 80 hours a week, trying to get a game released. Again, I think that some of them might have put that into the on rare occasions because they're like, oh, it's just during the last 3 months or the last 6 months. But I think that if you're working all the time, crunch time, there are probably some serious structural issues going on there. The biggest issue that I have with working this much crunch time is that you just end up, you end up doing bad things, right? Especially as a programmer. The more you work or spending more time on stuff doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get better results. I've had plenty of times where people just keep coding and coding and coding, and then they're working crazy nonstop hours, and you have to delete all of the stuff that they did anyway because they were so busy just trying to get a thing done. Nothing was getting done right. So things were getting done sloppily and quickly just to try to get, meet some deadline. And then you find out like, oh, okay, well, we actually need to go back through and delete and redo all of this. So a lot of the crunching ends up being for nothing. Again, unless it's for these emergencies, like right before release, we got to go do something. It tends to be wasted time, at least from what I've seen. Now, there are probably some scenarios where people crunch and it makes a huge difference and they don't end up deleting everything. But most of the time, what I've seen is when people are working way too many hours, they're not doing their best work, they're not doing very good stuff, and we end up having to kill it all. So I wanted to go down and just kind of scroll through this and look at some of these other data points and then talk about MMOs. So how many hours do you work weekly, or did you at the last game job? I thought this part was interesting, and I felt like maybe I should have changed the green part to be like 41 to 45, because I feel like a lot of us probably work a little bit more than 40 hours a week on our games, but not too much more, and that's probably largely driven by passion. At least it is for me. Like I'm probably more on that purple line of the 51 to 80. In fact, I know I'm on that purple line of the 51 to 80, maybe even on the blue one sometimes. But it's good to see that most people aren't, right? Most people are not working more than 50 hours a week. And I know that might seem like an odd point, like an odd breaking point, like why is it okay up to 50? But I think that for the kind of job that we're doing here, making games, it's hard to not go above 40 just because most of us get really into it and really passionate about it. And it's hard to just kind of be like, okay, I'm done with my 8 hours or my 40 hours for the week. I'm not going to work on this thing anymore. I'm going to wait until Monday or whatever. A lot of the time, for me and a lot of people I know, like we're working on stuff and then we get home and we just want to finish it, right? We want to see it in action. And I think a lot of that is just from that visceral feel of like we've done something and now we can see it in game and we can show it to people, and it's just really exciting. But I was pretty happy to see that, this basically looks like a big old Pac-Man for the two smaller numbers, which I thought was pretty nice. And it showed that there is still a little bit of this area where people are working crazy amounts, but the amount of people working, more than 80 hours is tiny. One person put that in. That's good. Okay. And then this was I'd say the next most interesting thing I saw about the crunch data was how people felt about it. Most of them didn't like it, but felt it was necessary. And I'm somewhat in the same boat when I've had to work crunch time myself. Again, it's usually, and it's really only been in a case where something was about to release or we were about to give a big demo that was going to maybe make or break with investors or something else. It was going to have a really big impact, or we're going to a show and we need to get something ready for this show because it's got a very hard deadline and we don't have, we can't push back, E3 or some other big event. We have to be there on time. So in those cases, I would say I felt it was necessary. I also never really had to do it enough where I felt like it was a big deal. And, the percent of people who really didn't like it, really hated it, was relatively small too. Those are probably, I need to do the data pull out, but I bet that those are probably a lot of the same people who hated, or who are working the crazy amounts. And then, almost about half the people are not compensated. More than half the people are not compensated. I've seen this quite a few times where people say, hey, yeah, we're going to work crunch, but then you'll have this extra time off that you can take whenever. But it's like the time off isn't, you know, when it's kind of like when you have unlimited PTO at a company, like you have this time off, but nobody's taking it, and there's never a time that's good to take it. So it's pretty common to get into that scenario of you're working overtime and you're expecting that you're going to get the time back off later, and you never do. I just kind of expect it now. Like if I'm working overtime, to be honest, I just assume that I'm not being compensated for it. In the U.S., that's relatively common to work overtime on games or even any software, and it's very rare to be compensated for it. On the upside, the salaries are usually good enough, and the benefits and bonuses are good enough that it doesn't make a huge difference. Also, if I work crazy amounts of overtime, I just subconsciously take some time off, here and there later on. But when you're working full time at a company, it can be, I'd say, a bit harder to do that. Anyway, I was surprised to see that 20% said yes, and that 25% were actually paid overtime in cash. I assume most of them are not in the U.S., and there's some legal reason for it. Okay. Oh, and somebody said in chat, you don't think working 80 plus hour weeks results in a better game? No, I would say it definitely does not. It probably results in a longer release cycle and a lot more bugs. And have you ever been threatened over crunching? This one was good too because it was relatively small, right? Like most people never felt at risk, and a large chunk, or I guess a reasonable percent of people felt like they might have maybe had a problem. And then the percent of people who were actually threatened with it, or in the boat where they're pretty sure they're going to get fired, is relatively small, right? 14%. If you're in one of those positions too, where you're having to do a ton of crunching, it's not paid and it's a common thing, and you're at risk of getting fired, I'd start looking for a new job. Just look for a better place to work. You don't have to work crazy hours to get a project done or to do a good job at it. In fact, like I've said a couple times already, if you're working crazy amounts of time and stuff, you're probably doing the opposite of getting things done. You're probably just causing more problems and slowing down because of it. And then a breakdown of what people were working on. A lot of people independent, only 12.5% on in a AAA studio, and the rest in indie. And it was mostly programmers and some designers. The other thing I wanted to point out too is that when I said that I've seen people crunch a lot, almost always it wasn't the programmers, it was the designers. It was just the design and content team working crazy hours to put things into the games, to tweak them and tune them and make them interesting and fun to play. So it's not just like a programmer thing. A lot of time it was designers or even artists. I feel like they had to crunch more than any programmer in any of the places I've ever been. All right, I want to talk about MMOs too, though. So I'm going to do a full video on crunching once I get all of my thoughts kind of together, and I think break this data down a little bit more. But I just wanted to talk through it real quick, and I really want to talk about MMOs and just building games in general. So I wanted to see, did anybody submit questions? Yeah, let's pull over the little question form. I got 7 of them. So let's just go through them real quick and see what we got here. First question is, well, what are your PC specs? I don't know. Let's see. What are we running now? We can just pull it up and check. It's an i7 7700K, I believe. And 32 gigs of RAM, Z720X board. I'm pretty sure it was a 77X. Yeah, 7700K, sorry. So 7700K and 32 gigs of RAM and a 1070. I was actually looking into getting a Threadripper though, because they look so much faster. I don't know if you guys have seen these, but if you're building games, if you go to cpubenchmark.net and just look at high-end CPUs, the Threadrippers now, like, where's this one right here? 3900X is insanely fast. It's about 3 times faster than the one I'm currently using. So we got that at 31954 compared to this one at 11. So it's close to 3 times faster. Funny thing is the CPU price is the same, right? $459. Although I'm sure that's probably an outdated price because I've had this thing for quite a while. But the new one, I think they were $470 on Amazon or something. where was that one? Yeah, 470 right here. So if you're looking at buying a processor, I would definitely look into these. Oh, this one's not even the Threadripper, right? This is just the 3900X. There's the 3960. That's way too expensive though. But yeah, I would look at some of these AMD processors now if you're looking at something new. They just seem to have caught up and surpassed Intel performance-wise and way ahead on the prices. So that's yeah. Quick question. Let's go on to the next one. What's the best way to make a single-player RPG? Should it be from the ground up or made on another package / asset / library? Whew. Depends a lot on your skill and experience level. So if you're just starting out, I would say use a pre-built package. Like if you're new to game development, you've never even thought about building a game before, or you've never built something similar to an RPG before, I would start with grabbing a package on the asset store and use that as kind of your beginning point. I think eventually you'll run into problems and find things that are hard to do, but then on version 2, build it from scratch yourself. I wouldn't necessarily try to build a single player RPG unless you've got some game dev experience before and you have a good idea of how you want to put it together. There are just a lot of systems involved in building a single player RPG. You've got to do everything from AI, NPCs, inventory, character setup, possibly character customization, abilities, loot, probably some sort of questing system. There's a lot, and that's all on top of all of the base stuff, and then the combat system that makes your game interesting and unique, assuming it's a combat-based RPG. It's actually something I'm working on in the architecture course. We're actually building out a single-player RPG, and there are just a ton of things to do. There's a lot of stuff to do in there, a lot of different components, and they all need to interact together and not turn into a mess. So I would say start with a library or a package or something if you haven't built something like this before, and then maybe try on version 2 to build it from the ground up. There's just so many things that you have to come across or that you have to put together to make it work that I wouldn't just try to start it with no plan and no idea at all. All right, how would you go about setting up a server for a smaller, low-budget multiplayer game? In this case, I think I would go with the mirror system. So just set that up and then run a. But it depends. I say that, but that's if you want to do like a real-time live multiplayer where you're running around and it's asynchronous or synchronous, sorry, where the players can see each other moving and stuff. If you're doing something where it's a multiplayer game, but it's kind of turn-based or asynchronous, I'd do a completely different system and maybe set up something with lambdas and AWS where we handle the events or the data through some sort of a web request or just a direct connection there instead of building up a server. Just mostly because you're saying low budget. So assuming you're trying to keep that budget down really low, you might want to avoid running a dedicated server. But it depends a lot on the type of game that you're trying to build there. Let me pull up chat. I can't see chat on here on top of what I'm reading here. So let's see. I'm making a top-down shooter and I'm at the AI part. In your opinion, how complex should AI be? I would say only as complex as it needs to be. Don't overcomplicate it and don't overthink it. I've seen a lot of people and companies that I've worked at come up with these insanely advanced or supposed to be advanced complex AI systems where the AI is trying to figure things out and you're building out these giant graphs of stuff that the AI can do and figure out. And they end up just never releasing, never shipping, or just not being interesting and fun. I read a post, it was just a couple days ago, about how the dumber an AI is, the smarter it seems. And that's just because when you make AI, I'd say smart, it tends to just overcomplicate things and confuse things and make it not feel natural and good. I would make the AI just good enough to trick the players into thinking that they're at that smartness level that you want and nothing beyond that. Overcomplicating the AI tends to just lead to I said, mostly just what I've seen is people just not shipping, or they end up just stripping it down and going back to something simple. I think a basic state machine can handle most AI stuff that you want to do. A behavior tree can work well too, although I generally prefer state machine because I find that they're just easier to understand and debug and go through the flow and kind of get them set up the way that you want. Behavior trees work well, but I'm just not a huge fan of the way that they describe things. At least not when it comes to more complex interactions. I want to know your thoughts on why big studios are not making games like God of War for mobiles or Uncharted, but with mobile compatible graphics. I don't know. My guess is that they just don't see it as a market where they're going to make money. A game like God of War, they sell it for $60, and if they try to do that on mobile, they're going to sell it for $5, maybe 10 at most. Probably get less sales and make a whole lot less money. That's my guess. And plus, when they target things like a console, I'd say it's quite a bit easier than targeting mobile because you just have this one set of hardware. You don't have, well, now it's not really one set of hardware, right? There's 6 or 7 different Xboxes, something ridiculous, multiple PlayStations, but you have at least a base level. You don't have hundreds of new devices and hundreds of different devices that all act differently. Targeting a console is easier, and I think probably just more profitable is the reason. By the way, you guys can all see my screen now. So if you have more questions, I put the link to submit questions just in the description. Just go ahead and submit them, and I'll try to read chat once I get through all of these too. So what kind of architecture or design pattern is the best for a side-scroller game with 30 levels, and which one for an RPG? An MMO is too difficult for me. Thanks in advance. That's so it's not like a single design pattern here when it comes to building out a game or a single like just wide. It'd be nice if there were just some big architecture names that just kind of represented things. I'll look into that, but I can't give just like a single thing for this. For a side scroller with 30 levels, the basic architecture for that, I'd say, well, the basic project structure for that, you're probably just going to end up with, depending on how long these levels are and how they're set up, assuming that they're customized so that each level is different. You've got different stuff going on there, different objects in there, different assets in there, so that you're changing out the theme. Thinking of like a Mario game where you're running around and you're in the ice level and you're in the desert and whatever. Those would probably just be separate scenes set up, and then you'd have a single game state management system or game state controller that's taking the player through those different scenes, loading those different scenes up. But I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this with a design pattern, because there really isn't just like a single pattern. It'd just be a game setup. I'd set up a single scene for your general game state related stuff, another scene for your UI stuff that's going to pop on top of that. So you're not going to have all of that in all of these levels. The levels themselves should probably just include a spawning point for your character. Again, just thinking a Mario system there, because your character's state could change like from one level to the next, right? Like you get into level 5, you may or may not be the big fire dude, or if it's a spaceship, you may or may not have these upgrades on your spaceship. So you'd have a spawn point in each of those levels. You'd load up the level and then initialize the player to that spawn point with whatever their current data is. And you'd keep that current data around in another scene or in some static instance of an object or a scriptable object that's keeping track of the actual player data, and then drop the player game object there. And the game object itself, though, I think you'd probably end up just recreating it when you go into the level, but creating it from the data at that spawn point. I don't know if that helps a lot with your question, but it was an interesting one to talk about, I guess. Let's see. How do you go about... Oh, I answered that. Answer that. Okay, how long would it take for a beginner developer to make a story-based offline game that would take around 20 hours of gameplay? I don't know. I mean, hundreds or thousands of hours possibly. If you already have a system for your story-based game and it's really just about plugging in the story, then it'd be a lot faster. But if you're just trying, like, it's such an open-ended question that, like, that could be, you're building something super complex with all kinds of different things in it, or you're just building a story. Let me go to individual mode. The questions are just popping all around here. So I don't know that I could give a good answer for that one on how long it would take. I would expect it to take a very long time, but I would build out the entire story system first and then dive into actually filling it out. So just do like a little chunk, try to build out like a half-hour slice of it first. And I think that a lot of people should do that for their games. If you're building something, you're building a big game, don't try to build the entire thing first. Build out a little chunk of it, just a little vertical slice, get a 15, 20, 30-minute slice of it, build that and see what it feels like. And not just for the whether or not this game is going to be fun and people are going to like it and play it, because that's important. You want to get it out there and have people do it. But you also want to see the types of problems that you run into, the code problems, the architecture problems, the things that break along the way, so that you can fix them early instead of later. Don't try to build out the entire thing, just get that little chunk. Let's go on to the next one. C# actions, good or not, for loading and unloading methods into action like current player action. Sorry, just saw my wife out the window. So C# actions, are they good? Yes. I use C# actions in the type of like the event action. I use them all the time. Now, for current player action, I'm not sure exactly what you're doing here. I think what you're talking about is putting a delegate into the action and then invoking that action. That's not something that I generally do, if that's what you're talking about. It's essentially like you would say, hey, I have this action and I'm just assigning it here. Let me maybe pull up a bit of code and just write out what that would look like. So you'd have like a public action do thing, whatever. Or let's call this current player action. And we'll make it private, right? And then we had a void activate current action. And then what we're doing is saying like current action dot invoke, right? And then having a way to set the action. So you'd have like a void set action new player action. And then here you could say current player action equals new player action. Let me maximize this and hopefully it's readable. So assuming that you're asking it like this, where you're like, hey, I've got this action and I set the action here, and then whenever I tell them to activate their action, they do it. So like maybe this is bound to if the player presses left click, right? So they hit input.mouse down and it calls this activate current action. I don't necessarily do this because I find it just a little bit harder to debug and to tell what's going on. Instead, I would pass in a class for this. So it'd be more like a iAction. Let's see. Maybe I don't like iAction. Thing to do, or let's see. Maybe like iPlayer action, right? So make an interface like this and have an iPlayer action. And then I would set the iPlayer action to this thing. And then this would have its own implementation. And it'd be, I guess you're ending up doing something kind of the same, but you're wrapping it and making it a bit more specific to the type of thing that you're doing. So it's not just any old event action. We're actually passing in, we'd be setting some implementation here. So it'd have like an action. Hopefully this is making sense to everybody following along. But it'd have like a public class jump action. And then what I could do is say, hey, set the action to the jump action. Then whenever they do the jump action, it does the thing. Now invoke wouldn't be the action, call it like act. And we'd add it on there, and then we'd add this. So we go implement the interface here, and then this would like do the jumping. So we'd be able to set an action here. We'd pass that in on our player. Right now we're in an inventory script. Just ignore that. It just opened up an existing project. So say we're on a player and we said, hey, the new player action is jump. So whenever they hit the button, they jump. We'd pass in the jump action, and then our activate current action would just do the jump action instead of whatever the other action is. So I'd do that instead of just the generic action. Again, mostly just so that my code is easier for me to understand and I know what types of actions these are, and I'm not just passing in arbitrary delegates or methods that we're calling. Let's jump over to the next question. That one's kind of complex. Is it a good idea to use Houdini to make procedural house or VFX for Unity? Please tell me your best idea. So I haven't used Houdini personally in any projects yet, but we are, I think, going to be using it for Pantheon stuff. So I'm going to be diving into it hopefully quite a bit pretty soon. I would say it seems like a good idea. I have not heard a good argument against it. So if you're looking at it, if you haven't used Houdini, let's just pull it up real quick. It's a procedural generation system. Let's see. Is this it? I'm not sure where their main page. Yeah. Houdini for games. So it's a. I have to pull up a good example of it. I haven't seen too many of them yet because like I said, we just kind of made the decision that I think we're going to be doing it. But it's a procedural generation system for generating worlds, content, all kinds of stuff. And it makes it so that you can pre-generate big, large areas and then go in and change them and modify them and do all kinds of cool things. It seems like it's a big hit with everybody who's used it, so I can't see a reason to say no. I would say if you're looking into it, definitely look closer, look further, and give it a try. Can you do or plan a tutorial on how to add bot AIs to a multiplayer game? Possibly. I need to do a video on how to set up a multiplayer game, so maybe we could do that as a follow-up to that. So bot AIs in a multiplayer game aren't really too much different than bots in a single player game. It's more just the multiplayer part of how to replicate those and get those moving around, and how to run them on a server if we're just running in a client server architecture where we don't have any clients that are authoritative. By the way, if you guys don't mind hitting like, I really appreciate it. Get that number up like over 100. If like everybody that's in here hit it, it would go way up fast. Okay, let's go on to the next question. How to build a game studio when I'm 15. I'm already working as a Unity 3D developer, more in terms of creating the team and making it all work, not just making random things taking a lot of time. That's interesting. So building a game studio is a lot different from building a game. It's much more of a managerial type experience and job. It's a lot more about managing interpersonal relationships and keeping people on task and keeping everybody working on the same thing. I wouldn't necessarily start with building a game studio until you're building a game. I would start building the game first and then work on a studio, especially when you're at the age, at 15, or you're not at a point where you're going to just come in with a bunch of money where you can hire people. Because getting people to work on a project for a studio or even outside of a studio where it's all like essentially no money up front, where you're not getting paid, is extremely hard, and managing that is way harder than managing a studio where you're actually paying people. So I would start with just going really small. Just find one other person that wants to work with you on projects, maybe two other people, and start working with them and collaborating with them as much as possible. If you're going to work with other programmers too, try doing some pair programming. Just do it online and work together on writing some code and building some stuff together, and get used to that process of seeing each other's code, working on each other's code, and editing it. The one thing you really want to avoid when you get into this scaling up, where you're not just yourself, but you've got other people there, is silos, where you end up with one person wrote one system and knows that system. Nobody else knows it. Nobody else touches it because they're afraid it'll break or they don't understand it. And then you have another system that one person worked on and nobody else touches, and everybody's afraid it'll break. So nobody improves it. Nobody makes modifications, and anything that's wrong with it, people just continue to do. And this doesn't just happen with small companies or small people starting up. This happens at big studios all the time. I've seen this many, many times where there's like one guy that does network stuff and that's it. Nobody else understands the network. When that guy leaves, if there's debug stuff in the network code, that debug stuff stays in the network code because nobody understood that's what it was there for, or that's what it was, and it kills performance for years to come. Literally a true story. We've had situations where one person knows the database stuff, and that's it. Like, they leave and suddenly it's just nobody knows how to do anything with the database, or one person knows the rendering pipeline and nobody else. So you really want to avoid that at all costs, and pairing is a great way to minimize the risk of that and kind of break down those silos. I'm going to go on to the next one. I made software using Unity and sold it in a thumb drive, about 60 thumb drives sold. When do I reach a point of having to pay for Unity? I think that's when you hit $100,000 in sales. So unless you're selling those for, $1,500 a piece, I think you're good. When asked where to learn, you often direct to video tutorials. Would you recommend any books about Unity/C# programming for Unity and design? None that I can think of anymore. There were some, but they all just get out of date so fast, right? The language changes and the engine changes so much. It's really hard to keep things in print that are updated. I don't know of any that are super up to date, to be honest. And that's why I like to do videos. My NavMesh component works well in the editor, but when I add a few more AIs using the NavMesh component and made a level with occlusion culling on, it works fine in the editor, but when I port to mobile, some agents won't work and some don't. Oh, some work and some don't. I don't know the answer to that. I would say try attaching when you're running in mobile and doing a little debugging and see if you can figure out what's going on. But I'm not sure. That's not a problem that I got any thoughts or insight into immediately. If anybody in chat has an idea of why that might happen, though, please just drop a message and let us know. I just can't think of anything offhand. Oh, you know what? Let me go into Streamlabs. Let me see if I can add chat onto here too, and people can see the. Let's see how that works. Okay, I don't know if it's going to show up or not. Okay, how to write a story for the game. You got to get good at writing. I'm terrible at it myself. I've tried multiple times. I gave up on trying to be a game writer / designer. I'm not that good at it. I have a Discord server. Somebody asked, why don't you start one? I have one. I just don't talk in there very often. There are quite a few people in there all the time, though. I will link the server down in chat in just a moment. Let's go do that now. So invite, and we'll set this up. Here we go. Copied, and I'll paste it into chat. Is unit testing worth the time and effort if you're the only programmer on this project and more or less know where to expect your code to change? Yes, if you're going to keep the project around. So if the project is going to last more than maybe 3 months, I would say yes, unit testing is worth your time and effort, because while you know it now, in 2 years, you're going to forget it, right? You're going to change, you're going to be a different programmer, and you're not going to remember how everything works. And eventually, if you're still working on the project, making active changes, you're going to break something. You're going to break something unexpected, and it's going to be painful and a problem, right? So you want to really, assuming that you care about minimizing breaking things in production and you don't want live or bugs going live, you definitely want to test as much as possible, test ideally everything. I've become a convert somewhat recently to the idea of testing as much as I possibly can and automating all that testing so that things don't break in the future. Every time I write tests, I discover something new. I find a bug in existing stuff just accidentally while I'm writing tests. And it prevents the bugs from reappearing later. And when I think about working on AAA MMOs, like we had 3 buildings at Sony. One entire building was dedicated to QA. And QA's job is literally just to make sure that the programming and design teams did their jobs properly. I guess a lot of the time people say that QA is there just to make sure that programming did their job correctly. But in games, it's really programming, design, and art. So we can't necessarily get rid of the need for QA completely because there's design stuff and we don't have a good way to automate testing of whether or not designers' designs are good or they work or they make sense. And we don't necessarily have a good way of automating all of the art testing. We can set up some tools to make it easier to test art, but testing art still requires at least some level of visual inspection. The code side, though, theoretically, if we're doing our jobs right, we shouldn't be sending any bugs to QA, right? We should be sending code to QA that is bug-free, that's automatically tested, and we should know when we send the code in, when we commit it, that it works and there are no issues. Unit tests are really the only way for us to know that. Otherwise, we're just guessing it and assuming that everything's good. We don't know it for sure. If we've tested all of our project and we can run those tests, we have verification that, hey, what we did works, and not only that, it didn't break other things. So I'd say yes. Test, test, test. Again, if you're doing a quick throwaway project, you're doing a hackathon, doing some little thing that's going to last for 3 months, you're never going to touch it again, it's much less of an issue. And on those bigger projects where they're going to stay around, though, test like crazy. How do MMOs handle all the armor sets for different race character proportions? Very differently. I've seen them do it in quite a few different ways. Sometimes there are different versions of the actual models. A lot of the time what we'll do is make the armors actually scale and adjust to the character's or to the character's race, essentially. So the race will have some markers on there, or have some markers on the character for where the pieces are going to snap to and what they're going to scale to. It's actually kind of a big pain in the ass, to be honest, getting the armor sets and items to show up, especially armor sets, to show up correctly on different races and different characters can be a lot of work. A lot of time, again, you'll have to do custom versions of them or modified versions of the models too. I've seen like some games I've seen that's literally what they do exactly. Every race has its own version of the model. That's a lot more artwork though. It's a lot heavier on the art pipeline. So what we can do is make those things scale based on the race with some mesh tools. I haven't done a lot of it myself, so I don't want to dive into the real details of it, but it might be something we could talk about in a separate video just on how to set up armor for characters, because it's not just MMOs. It's going to be the same for single player games where you can change your race or modify your character dramatically. All right. This question, okay. Let me see if this is all showing up right. Okay, so it says, this question is a bit off topic, but you talked about game dev opportunities in a previous live stream and something that did not make a lot of sense to me. Well, you said that a lot of game dev companies pay quite a lot, 100K plus. The question is, why aren't you working in those companies? Is being indie more profitable for you, or did you make enough money with these companies that you don't have to worry about your financial situation in the future? Oh, you can skip this if it was too personal. No, so it's a good question, right? There are a lot of opportunities that pay well over 100K, right? The more senior advanced game dev jobs can pay into the low twos, sometimes even higher than that. Most of the time, though, they also require you to be on site all the time, and you got to work with large groups of people and a lot of the time manage things or mentor people while you're there when you're at that level. Working on site is not something I have any interest in anymore. I've gotten to the point where working indie totally supports my lifestyle and allows me to work from home and record YouTube videos, courses, and all kinds of other things as much as I want. And I really personally like the freedom of it. And I don't have to worry about the money side at all. When we talk about game salaries, though, so let's briefly talk about these. So when you're starting off, like an entry-level game dev job, depending on the area, is going to pay dramatically different. But in the area that I'm in Southern California, you can probably expect to make anywhere between, I'd say, 50 and 90,000 as a starting game programmer, based on your experience, the exact area, and just how much that company really wants to hire you, or how much that company has available. Got all kinds of random little pop-ups appearing. So that's just when you're starting out, though. After a couple years, you should be able to make quite a bit more than that. But when I started out programming, let's see, my first actual programming job in the AAA industry was only making, I say only, but it's still a decent amount. It's 55,000, right, when I came down to work at Sony as a programmer. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that was actually pretty low compared to everybody else there and just the standard. So it took a little bit of time to build that up, and it'll take that, I think, for anybody to build up. You're going to be able to, I don't even know, like, I feel like I'm just kind of rambling now, but over time, you're going to be able to build up the amount that you're worth and the amount that you can make in the game industry pretty dramatically. And once you hit like that, I'd say a 5-year mark, if you're at least, again, in this area specifically, you should be over 100,000 as a programmer in Southern California, or probably anywhere in California, at least as a game programmer. Again, that cost of living is dramatically higher here, so those rates are going to be higher. But if you're in the Bay Area, like 100K is probably around a starting entry salary, again, because the cost of living is higher. But again, to why I'm not working for those, it's mostly just I really like the freedom of what I do. I get to work on a AAA MMO from home and do all of these other things and have a blast with it. So that's why I don't work at any other company. But again, also for anybody that's not sure, I am working actively on a AAA MMO too. It's just I do it from home, and I get a lot more done this way. It's surprising too, because a lot of time people think that if you work from home, you're just not doing things. And I've seen that in the past, right? I've been to companies where people worked from home, but that really just meant that they had their laptop around and they answered Skype if somebody sent them a message. Maybe they spent 20, 30 minutes during the day working. But when you work from home full time and your job is just to work from home, one of two things happen. Either you get super productive and you realize that you're constantly at work and you're always able to get things done and you feel like you're not wasting time, or you waste a lot of time, burn out fast, and that job disappears. Right? So if you don't do that, if you don't do the whole, like, I'm going to sit around and do nothing and just randomly respond to Skype, what I've found and what I think a lot of people find is that you end up getting a lot more done, right? You get more stuff done in less time. I think part of that too is just the whole idea of going into an office, right? When you go into work, even if you're not doing anything, you're still at work. So it still counts. And you can still kind of, I think, psychologically trick yourself and your whole team into thinking that, hey, they were at work, 5 days this week. So they obviously worked 5 days worth of stuff. A lot of times that's not the case, though. I mean, how many times you go to work and you see people just standing around, hanging out in their offices, talking about random stuff, going for 2-hour walks in the middle of the day where they just go blab about some random non-work related stuff, right? And I mean, sure, sometimes you need breaks, but a lot of the time that just becomes the norm where, in an 8-hour day, you're working 2 or 3 hours and the rest of the day is just wasted in either meetings or preparing for meetings or waiting for meetings or going to talk to somebody real quick or somebody coming to talk to you, or hey, we need to have a real quick team huddle and chat about something. Like, all of those things kind of disappear when you're working from home and when you're working kind of on your own and you have to manage your own time. And it really just becomes about, what did they commit? Does it work? Does it get the job done? Does it meet what we wanted to get done this week? And you can really focus on that. But again, you might end up doing what I do and just working a ton too. Because when you only work from home, you're kind of always at work. And my wife tells me that all the time, that I work way too much. But every time I wake up, I walk down, I'm in my office, and like, it's just there. All right. Yep, it's interesting. Ben just commented in chat. There have been days at work and he's not been able to muster constructive code and just watched YouTube or gone for 35-minute tea breaks. It's the same, man. We go for like hour-long Starbucks breaks, where we walk down to Starbucks and go get coffee and hang out and have some pizza and just chill because I'm just not ready to code. So I don't know. I feel like when you're working from home, that time doesn't just automatically get counted towards your productivity, and you can't trick yourself into thinking that, hey, just because I drove to work today and sat in the office, I did something valuable, right? You actually have to do something valuable to get that feeling. So I feel like if you can be motivated from home and you can avoid the distractions and not have too many of them going on, you can get a lot more done in the same amount of time or in less time. Okay, do you know the Cat-Like Coding blog? What do you think about its tutorials? I do know it. I love it. They're great. They're usually really in-depth about specific topics, and I find them pretty damn interesting. You like the picture of Vanguard on the wall? I love that too. It's up there in the corner, by the way, for anybody who doesn't know. It's a MMO. It was actually the first AAA project I got to work on. It was a lot of fun. It was one of my favorite games and had a lot of really cool features in it. And pulling a lot of the really cool features from that game into Pantheon, the new game that I'm working on too. What is my go-to IDE? That would be Rider, JetBrains Rider. This one right here. I really love this IDE, this editor. I was a big, giant Visual Studio nut. As you can see, here's my Visual Studio love here. This is a WPF project. It's not Unity stuff. But I used to use Visual Studio, I don't know, since 2005 all the way up until 2019. I was a giant fan. I still use it a little bit for some things, but if I'm building a Unity game, Rider is by far my default choice. And there are a lot of reasons for it. The biggest just that it encourages you to do good things. It encourages you to refactor your code and make it cleaner. It gives you hints on when you do things bad. Here it's just telling us, hey, you're accessing the transform component twice. You could make that more efficient. I don't care about it in this very specific case, but a lot of the time when we're accessing things, I do care about it because we're doing it in an update loop and I want to optimize these things. Or to tell me to use expression body properties or expression body members, all kinds of things. I really like it. So I'd say Rider by far. Go for Rider. They have a free trial available too. Why are you using PHP Storm IDE instead of Visual Studio? It's Rider. Why don't you make a vlog or something, chilling out with friends and family in addition to just making educational videos? I don't know. Maybe I will. Sounds like fun. Just kind of chat and talk about game stuff or talk about game development. And yeah, I was working on Pantheon. Somebody mentioned in chat. Oh, people can't see my screen. I'm sitting here blabbing and showing off my screen. And oh, goodness. Okay. Let me go back. That was my fault. So when I was talking about Rider, this is what I was showing. So showing here's the little tip that it's given saying, hey, repeated property access, or the expression body properties. Right, do like get return items. Oops. Let's do that the correct way. So you can do that, and if I just put my mouse over here and hit enter, you can see it's recommending to cut these 4 lines down into 1. So it goes, hey, you should do that. And then when you do something wrong, it'll tell you, hey, this is what's wrong with it. So, you know, and it gives you like a full document or a web page that explains why it recommends certain things. So I really like it for that. Okay, let's go on. Ways to fake shadows. Yes. The easiest thing I've done for that is just throw like a little circle underneath them. So like a flat quad underneath them that just is black circle and does like a real quick fake shadow. There are a bunch of people who have done similar things to this where you do these little cutout shadows below. I'm not sure of other really good ways to fake shadows, I can't think of anything else. That's the one that I've done the most though. Or just put like a little shadow underneath the dude basically. Game ideas for portfolios. I always recommend go with something that people will understand. So something that's a take on an existing game so that people can get in there and play it, but add in your own twist. Make it unique and slightly different because, you know, it starts off one way and then jumps into something totally different or somewhat different. One of the good examples I saw of this was an asteroids game. So it's like starts off like asteroids, and then 20 seconds in, you start getting upgrades that shoot out different directions, and suddenly it becomes like, hey, it's like asteroids, but it's got these extra interesting new mechanics in it. So I would go with something like that, something where it's well enough known that you don't have to explain it to people how to play. They can get in and play it right away, but has your own special take on it, so it doesn't just feel like a flat, straight rip of a game or like you followed a tutorial. Also, make sure that you can play them online so that people can actually get in and play a WebGL version of it. They don't have to download it or anything else. You want to make sure that it's as accessible as possible. Otherwise, people just aren't going to play it. If you're applying for jobs and you're sending out an executable, you're probably ruling out 75% of those automatically because people don't want to risk running it on their work system and getting some random virus. Okay, I'm looking at making a complex interaction system when a single NPC or something else has different possible interactions like dialogue, training, quest, etc. Thinking of making an interaction class that inherits from a scriptable object. But I'm not sure how I would update it accordingly to story. Ideally, NPCs would offer different dialogue depending on progress. But if the player has an active quest, they would default to their dialogue in the quest dialogue. My only idea was to dump everything on one character, but I'm guessing main characters would end up with thousands of ifs to check every quest and world state. Okay. Let me think. So single NPC could interact differently depending on what your character's current state is. So they would check to see if you're on a specific quest and maybe do something specific for that quest. Let me see. Default. So if they're on an active quest for that NPC, they would go to the quest dialogue form. Otherwise, they would show some default stuff. So I think what I would have here is I would have two separate systems here. There'd be a state machine for, well, let me think. Because it's really just like a single interaction system on this guy, like a dialogue. It's really just like a dialogue system and maybe a training system. And what you want to do is control what thing pops up based on their quest state. Let me think of how I would set that up. So I don't know that I would necessarily. You shouldn't have to check every quest and world state or anything like that. You should be able to just check whether or not the character is on a quest for that specific NPC. In which case, you'd probably have a set. Like there would be some sort of quest data for your character, right? This is, I assume, for your player. Assuming a single player game, it'd just be some singleton or static object there, or it could be something that's related to the character if it's multiplayer. But you have a quest object or quest data object that has all of your quest info for that character, and you would check that on the NPC interaction. I think I would pass in the thing that, so you want to interact with an NPC, I'd say, hey, NPC.interact, and pass in my character if there are multiple characters. Otherwise, maybe I'd just reference it inside there. And then have it check to see if you have a quest with that specific NPC. So I guess the quest system would say, hey, am I on this quest? And then the NPC could just check to see if you're on any of its quests. And it'd just be like a dictionary lookup of the quests that you're on. So I guess like you'd have a quests object on the character, have a dictionary of the quests, and then their current state or state data. It could also just be like a list of them or a hash set of them, of those quests. Like the quest, so sort of like a quest data object that's got the quest info and the current state of the quest. Maybe not even the definition of the quest, right? It just has like the current state of it. And then you check against that on the NPC when they interact to see if you're already on it. And then in there decide whether to show the new quest available dialogue or to jump to a specific point in the dialogue. I think it would be like a dialogue controller on the NPC that determines what dialogue to show, because you're assuming that you either want to show like the welcome dialogue or the here's quest info, like here's some stuff about your quest dialogue. I'm thinking of this more in like a World of Warcraft, like you run up, you say hail to this dude, and he says, hey, I'm whatever, some random gnome. I want you to go kill these things. Here's a quest, right? And you get it, you accept it, and that's all through a dialogue. So there's like a dialogue system that at the end adds a quest. So you've got this dialogue state machine essentially that you're running through, and that adds a quest at the end. And then the entry point for that, on the entry, we could have just a simple check that says, hey, in this dialogue, when you go into it, if you're already at this point, like you, or not so much at this point, but if you have this specific quest flag, then jump over to this point. And that's, I think, I would set up some flags as well as the quests, and then have those flags be getting flipped on as players progress through the quest, and then have those flags be input points in the dialogue system. So if you have a specific flag, instead of going on the entry right to the beginning, we'll go over to whatever point it is that you want to go to with that flag. Then you'll end up with a lot more control. So that way you can go like, hey, the flag is, hey, they've killed one guy, right? You can go into one subset that says, hey, you've killed some, but not enough. Or you've killed all 10, you go into this other point, and then it says, hey, you finished it. Here's the next piece of the dialogue, blah, blah, blah. And here's the thing to finish your quest. So I think I would set up a full state machine for the dialogue, a flagging system that your quests are checking for their current state. So they're checking to see whether or not you've passed some flags, not necessarily storing all of that state in the quest, but storing it in like a flag system for your character. And then having that quest checking its update state based on those flags. I think that's the most robust way to do it, so that you have full control over that flow, full control over where things go in and out of the dialogue, and the way that the quest updates and interacts. So you can have just anything can set a flag and progress the state of that quest along. I hope that kind of makes sense. I'm just thinking of how I would end up setting it up in a bigger scenario there. But yeah, essentially a big dialogue system, a big state machine there that has entry points that are reliant on a flag, so that whenever you hail the NPC or walk up and start interacting with the NPC, it goes in, checks the flags, finds the one that matches, and then goes into that entry point. Have you had to handle a lot of data for users in cloud databases? E.g. stats, items, bank, quest, progress, everything else you need to store? Or how do you handle a lot of that? So I wouldn't say I've done it much in what you would call a cloud database, but I mean, in a database in general, I've done a ton of that. And then those they just run in the cloud, right? They run on AWS or something. And really a cloud database is just a database that's running somewhere else where you're not managing it. So how do you handle that? I would say you store it, you break it down into, well, you have two options for it. You can either take the character and take all of their info, serialize it out, drop it into a big JSON blob, and then pull that back in whenever you need to. That can work fine as a good starting point. There's no reason not to necessarily start there until things get too complex. But then when things do get more complex, though, and you know that you're going to need a database, you get to the point where you actually need the database, and you need to store all of these items off, and you need to be able to query them and do other things that databases are good at. That's when you start just creating separate tables for a lot of these things. So items, for instance, would just be a table of so you'd have like a character table, right? So you got lots of characters in there. You have a character table that's got your character ID, which should just be like an auto-incrementing integer in a standard database, a name, maybe a user account ID if you have multiple characters per user, and then maybe a little bit of extra data on the character, but not much. Then the items table would just be a table that has character ID and item ID, and maybe nothing else. You might not need any item specific data beyond that. Then you just load the character, you load all of their items just by ID, and then instantiate all of those items on the player when they actually log in and spawn. You just create all of those items from that link right there. You don't want to store off all of the item data essentially. And that's how you can handle saving off a ton of them. You could also do something like that in a JSON scenario or some other non-database system where you're just saving off the item IDs instead of the entire item. What happens where it gets more complex though is when you want to start customizing items, because then you're going to need another set of info either in the item, probably not in the item table, but probably more in like an item mods table that then allows you to set up what the customizations to that item are. The main reason I wouldn't necessarily put it into an item table if you're using a standard relational database is you could end up with just a lot of columns that are unused for things like you might want to be able to modify anything on the item, like the strength, the damage, the health, or whatever. You don't want to add a column for all of those. So having an item mods table that just has the item ID, the mod type ID, and the mod amount makes it, I'd say, a lot easier to manage where you're not having to make those changes, because then you just go in and add in a new mod for the item. You just add those as objects on the item, right? You're just spawning, when you spawn the item, you load up all the mods, and then you instantiate one for everything in the database. Yeah, and then it's also easy to save off and pretty easy to query. All right, let's jump around. Just taking a quick peek at the chat. Somebody was asking again if this will stay on the channel. Yeah, this will still be available, so you'll be able to watch it later. And let's go to the next question. For the server side of an MMO, what kind of architecture is best suited for them? CQRS, MVC, a hybrid? Are most servers handling event sourcing? When a request is made on the client side, does the request get offered to a synchronized queue and then pulled for handling? How do you determine what type of action should be handled in asynchronous versus synchronous, etc.? Thanks. Okay, it's a big question. So CQRS, by the way, is the command query response. What does the S stand for again? Let's just segregation. Oh, command query responsibility segregation. It's essentially what happens is you're sending out a command and then you're getting a response back, or you're getting a query back. Or not really a query, but you're getting a response back from the server. So you send out a message and then something comes back to tell you whether or not whether or not it happened. But you're not getting back the same object. If you read right here, it says it's a different model to update the info, then you get to read the info. Or MVC or a hybrid. So most of the time, I'd say it kind of does fit into that CQRS, but not completely. What happens with MMOs is everything needs to be a request from the client. Almost everything. I shouldn't say everything, because some things we just want to cache client side for performance, right? We don't want to necessarily make a request to the server if we already know what the response is going to be and there's no, cheating implications, right? Like if we want to open up our inventory and we hit I, we don't send a message down to the server saying, hey, player wants to open their inventory. Can they open their inventory? We just pop that open immediately, right? It's when we want to do things that should be server authoritative, which is most actual interactions. Not moving. Moving is one where we do things a little bit different, but attacking things or toggling on and off an attack, replacing an item, looting an item, even setting a target is one of those things where sometimes we just don't want the client to be able to do it. But what we do in that case really is we allow the client to set it, then we send it down to the server, and then the server then can send back a message and say, hey, no, that's invalid, and then clear that out. But we also cache on the client whether or not they're allowed to target a thing, right? So let's see, so what generally happens though is that all of these messages get sent in from all of the clients. They're pulled on another thread that's reading in the network traffic, and then they get queued up to their very specific objects, right? So the player, whatever player is making the request, their player object on the server is going to handle that event. It's going to get the event that this player wants to do this thing. It's going to run through whatever it needs to do to make them do or not do that thing. Like they want to loot an item, or they want to send an invite to somebody else in the area to join their group. It's going to do that work there, usually on that next tick, and then it's going to respond back to the client immediately. So usually what happens, I would say almost nothing is really async when it comes to handling these, other than the fact that we're reading in the messages asynchronously. Everything else is pretty much synchronous. So we're only running one player action at a time. We're only responding to one player thing at a time. So they have to be fast. They have to be almost instant. There are a couple cases where we might start something off and then send out a message later, like we start to cast an ability. We might kick off a process that says, hey, start this, and then we have a timer going that's watching for when that timer ends, and it's got a callback to actually finish the ability. But we're also listening to see if they've moved or anything. I'm trying to think. Let's see. I hope that kind of helps. I don't know if that really makes a lot of sense. There are some alternative ways to do this. The problem that you can run into when you make these things asynchronous, so like if multiple players can do things on separate threads that interact with the same item, for example, you're going to run into problems where you can deal with it, but it gets a lot more complex. And you don't necessarily need to make the player interactions asynchronous to be fast. You can make it fast without that asynchronous part on just the server reactions, but you have to be, I guess, just really disciplined on keeping things clean and keeping them optimized. You can't sit around and do slow things. You can't be allocating a lot of memory in there or looping over big things. You have to keep things fast and quick, which is generally where things kind of fall apart. This is why MMOs get hard, because you can't just make them asynchronous easily. It causes all kinds of problems, causes bugs, and it works fine when you're playing a single player, and then suddenly everything breaks and you're spending years or months trying to figure out why things are busted. I'm going to go on to the next one. This is a big one. When did you start making games? I think the first time I tried to make a game, I was like 7, but it wasn't because like I was some game making genius or anything. I was just really desperate. I was 7 or 8 years old, and I had 2 games for my old Commodore. I think it was like a VIC-20 or Commodore 64. I don't remember which one it was on first. And I just didn't have any other games. So if I wanted games, I had to figure it out. And then I had these little magazines that had games that you could type in at the back of the book. So it'd be like 3 or 4 pages of code that you could just type in, and it would suddenly run. You'd have to type it every time you turn the computer off because it would lose it, didn't save anything, didn't have a floppy disk back in the day, or a hard disk for that matter. So yeah, started early out of necessity, and it kind of led down an unexpected path. Oh. Let's see if I can get this to work again. Okay, so here's a follow-up to the question earlier about actions. I'm going to go over this. So he said, previous action question was talking about this. So he's got a scenario with an action, current player action, and an update that runs the current player action. Okay. Oh, okay. I see it. So then there's a move player, an aim, and current player action is changing from aim to move player. And then when we switch to stop moving, we're switching from move player to aim. So essentially is unregistering aim and registering move player, and here unregistering move player but registering aim. So if you have to remove everything from current player action, you can. So yeah, I would say I would avoid this in general for a state machine instead, because I think that with a state machine you get the same level of control, probably a little bit more control, and it's a bit easier to understand and follow. So I would say go with, instead of switching from a move player to an aim in an action, I would switch from a moving state to an aiming state and then do the code in there. Mostly just because I think it's a little bit easier to understand and probably a little bit easier to unit test as well. This is an interesting way to set it up, though. But yeah, I think it would just scare me a little bit too much. Is it illegal to not pay for a Unity license once you've reached the requirement? I would assume so, but I am not a lawyer. I have no idea. I think that yeah, once you hit the 100,000, it should be pretty easy to pay for Unity. It's not too expensive, especially not if you're making 100,000 on it. How to make an ability system / skill system like a MOBA. I think you should make a series on that. Perhaps I should. So MOBA's ability system is pretty different from a lot of other games. So a MOBA, which is that mobile online battle arena, kind of like League of Legends, right? It's the number one example there. The skill system or abilities for that are all very, I would say, specific to the character because each character is getting like 4. The turnaround time on adding those in is weeks, right? Like they're not coming up with an ability, adding it instantly, and then implementing it, right? Like their turnaround time, they design it long before they probably come close to coding it, and then they start figuring out how they're going to set up the art, how they're going to make it work, how they're going to set up the actual ability. And my guess is that in something like League, they're probably very customized, but through some sort of a little mini scripting system by now. I think when they started, they probably were all hard coded, and they probably by now moved into something where they can script them up a little bit, but do a lot of custom work for them. I think it'd be an interesting series to do. It's definitely very different from how I would build an MMO's ability system, though, because those, when you're building out an MMO, you might think like, okay, there are like a dozen, maybe there are 10 classes, right? And each class has 50 abilities, just picking some semi-random numbers. And you're thinking, okay, we got about 500 abilities. And then you're like, there's probably like another 100 more on clickable items, right? And you might think like, okay, maybe we're at like 600 abilities. In a MOBA type system, a system where you're scripting these up, I think it's not too unreasonable to do that. You could probably get away with it. You could write them up and create them relatively timely matter. When it comes to an MMO, though, it's the player abilities are a tiny portion, right? It's like this small little chunk of it. I think to just Vanguard, right? Vanguard, last time I looked, it was a long time ago. It's probably, I don't know the exact numbers now. In fact, the game's dead now. But last time I looked, there were over 30,000 or 35,000 abilities in there. Very small percentage of them are player character abilities. Almost all of them tend to be NPC related abilities because with an MMO, you're building up all this content and it has to be the NPCs that you're putting together and these encounters that you're putting together need to have custom abilities. They need to be able to do all kinds of different things and things that are slightly different from, the frog locks in the other zone over there or the merfolk there. They need to all have these different abilities that just do different things. Not only do they look different, but they have different components to them, different ways that they act. So it gets much more complicated when you get into an MMO. I think an ability system one would be fun, though, because most people aren't building MMOs, right? They're building smaller things like this where you're going to end up with maybe a couple dozen abilities. Where can I see all the games that you worked on? There's some on Steam. Search for Rank 17 on Steam. You see a lot of the VR games that are made. Don't own them anymore. EverQuest 2. Go look that up. Vanguard, you can go look that up. There's some mobile ones. They're all a lot smaller and less exciting, though. Is it wise to make a single-player game RPG first to test if people like it, and after that an MMO if there are enough players? I would say that don't make a single-player game thinking that you're going to just convert it to an MMO. You can make a single-player game first, see if people like it, and then use what you've learned there to start building an MMO, but just don't expect that it's going to be like a transition where you take your single player code and it becomes MMO code. It's going to be very, very different. The way that you have to do things is very different. And not just to an MMO, but like going from single player to multiplayer. It's a huge jump, right? It's a total mindset and paradigm shift. So Yes, I would say make a single player first, probably before building an MMO. It's going to take you a tenth the amount of time, and you're going to be a lot more likely to finish it and be able to get a lot more of the story and interesting stuff in. If that becomes popular and you like it and you really want to do an MMO, then build an MMO after that. What are good resources about making an MMO? I don't know. I don't know of very many, which is one of the reasons I like doing these talks and just answering questions about MMO stuff, because I haven't found a lot of good info on making MMOs myself. I'm halfway done with a modular character pack that was originally going to be for personal use, but now I'm considering selling it on the asset store. The thing is, I originally was going to use shape keys to prevent clipping, but all the modular characters I see in the asset store are made of separate pieces. My problem with those is that Unity Light kind of makes it obvious where the body part starts and where the other begins, so I don't know what to do to prevent this. Any tips? Also, any recommendations for must-have modular character? Hand-painted post-apocalyptic survivor, if that matters. Oh, it's pretty exciting. I like the idea of the modular character pack that you're putting together. I don't know if I have any good tips on how to make them look better though. So it sounds like the lighting issue is causing a lighting issue that makes it obvious where one body part starts and the other begins. It's not something I'm good at building either. I wonder what. I don't know. If anybody has a good answer in chat, please drop it in there, because I've got nothing for this on how to get these to look right when you're putting together these modular bodies. Somebody else has always done these for me, so I haven't had a chance to do it. What kind of spatial partitioning data structure would you use for an MMO server-side code? Usually a quad tree, sometimes an octree if we're going to go 3 dimensions. So if you haven't used a quad tree, you should definitely look it up. For everybody who's watching who doesn't know what a quad tree is, I would say just go hop onto Google here, look up a C# quad tree example. Maybe one of these. Oh, here we go. Yeah. So maybe check out like this little C# example that explains it and shows what it's doing, and or some visualization for it. But that's essentially what we end up using usually, is just a quad tree. To start off though with a simple just grid. Right. Start with a grid, like a everything is the same size grid, and then switch over to a quad tree once you start to see the performance problems there. And then if you go 3-dimensional, go to an octree. That's what I would do. Pantheon or other projects, when are they going to release? I wish I knew. I don't know. If I did know, I probably wouldn't be allowed to say either, but I don't know. Do you have a streaming schedule? I want to know how often you'll be doing YouTube conferences. I don't now, but I might end up putting together one. It's been a little while since I did the last stream, and I like to get these going regularly. It's just life and other things getting in the way, preventing me from being somewhat consistent on these. But if I do end up with a consistent schedule, I'll put it in the YouTube channel. Maybe I'll put it up on the little banner there. A lot of people do that. They put what times and days they're live. So I don't know. I like to do this a lot though. As a new game dev, should I be actively avoiding remote or solo work projects so I can be in a team with more experienced programmers and ask and learn faster? No, I would say remote and solo, or I would try not to do too many solo projects. Remote stuff, especially remote stuff where you can pair online, would be great. I wouldn't. The main reason I would say don't avoid them is that just because you're on a team in person does not mean that the other programmers there are necessarily going to be very helpful or help you learn. So I wouldn't expect that to be automatic. Some places are really great at that. You're going to learn a lot from the other developers. You'll be working actively with them. A lot of places will just take you in and shove you into a corner, and you're essentially working solo, or just like you're remote, but you're in the office and talking to people every now and then. So I would say no, just look for remote jobs too, and try to do some pairing, just working with other people as much as possible. Okay, after I start trying to implement solid principles, things become way more complicated. Any ideas or advice to make this practice less painful. I'm actually going to do a video about that pretty soon. So I did the beginner video. It shows how to do Angry Birds. The whole point of that was so that I could do another video that goes into how to implement solid principles and how and why they help. It's very easy, I think, to implement principles from the solid without thinking about the benefits and the reason that you're doing it, and then do it in a way that does make things not only more complicated, but has zero payoff. And if you're not getting a payoff, you're obviously not going to continue to do it, right? So I'd say don't just try to shove them in wherever you can. Look for the pain points when you have a problem with your project, when you have something that you have to do, a change that you have to make that's suddenly not easy to make. Look at perhaps one of those principles that you might be violating in a way to adhere to that principle and that makes it easier to work with your code and makes your thing more sustainable. Again, I'm going to do a project, or it's going to be one or maybe more videos on implementing solid into an existing project. I'll probably just do one big long video on it where I just go through all of the principles and show how to put them into that Angry Bird project in a way that makes sense and is giving us benefit, not making things just more confusing. I had the same problem though when I first got into solid stuff. I would say I would kind of overdo it and try to abstract away too many things and make things less solid and not more solid on accident. Did you know you're the best teacher I've ever seen? No, I did not, but thank you for that. Can you explain why Pantheon is using zoneless and not seamless zones, and explain pros and cons of the technical side versus why the decision was brought back? I think the primary reason was that Brad wanted to do zoning. So Brad McQuaid was the guy who came up with the project. I remember when we first talked about it, he said he wasn't completely sure, but he thought he wanted to go with a zone-based game just because he tended to like them more. He wasn't a huge fan of big open world stuff. And I don't think he had any real technical reasons other than he just kind of liked zoning more. I guess one thing he did mention though was that he liked the fact that doing it with zones removed a lot of complexity. It removed a lot of design complexity and just programmatic complexity, because if you have a zoning system, you can just connect to that zone. You don't need to know about anything else other than that zone, and the system for doing that is all very, very straightforward. With a seamless or streaming system, things definitely get a little bit more complex, but you do get some benefits. And I don't know that Pantheon, there's really no reason that it couldn't switch to a seamless system if we wanted to. I just don't know that that's really more of a design decision than a technical one. It is more work to do streaming stuff, streaming seamless zones where you can just run across, but it's not an unbearable amount of work. Now, one thing Vanguard did that was kind of interesting is that it kind of mixed and matched both of those. So we had these zones, but then we had it kind of fake aseamlessness. So you would, once you got to the edge of a zone, you would transition over to another zone, and then it would kind of just pass all of your stuff along. It wasn't a great implementation though, because it caused a lot of problems with cross-zone fighting. So you could attack a thing on one zone line, like across the zone line, have it come over to the other zone line. Things would get weird and buggy because we'd be essentially sending an NPC over from one zone to another zone, or sending a player from one zone to another zone, and having that become the authoritative part for that entity, the player or the NPC. But then shit would just get out of sync, right? Like NPCs would bug out. Sometimes you'd end up with duplicate NPCs. You'd end up with ways to cheat and exploit NPCs. There ended up being a lot of issues there. So if you're going to do a seamless system, you need to really think it through and make sure that the entities that you have there, if they're going to be allowed to cross these zone lines, they need to probably not be necessarily directly tied to that zone. They need to be able to move across the entire world, really. And caused some other issues too, but there's really, again, it's mostly just a design decision at this point. Hello, is your Master Architects course for beginners? No, it's definitely more advanced. It's focused on primarily on my big obsession now of unit testing and writing big projects that are unit testable. The other course that I have is much more for beginners, the game dev course, where we go over a lot of the beginner stuff and kind of lead up to a point where you'd be able to handle the architecture course. Are you self-taught or university trained, and why Unity? So I got a degree in electronics. I used it to build some car stereos and a car alarm. That's about it. And yeah, I really decided I liked the software side. I'd done software before a little bit and just kind of learned from there. I've done almost all, I would say, self-taught, but it's really like essentially learning from other people. I take a lot of online courses. I watch a ton of online videos, just people talking about it. And I used to read a lot of books on software. Now it's almost all video content. Now, as for why Unity, I actually did a video about why I switched to Unity, but what happened was I was working on Vanguard, which was built in Unreal, then working on EQ2, which was all a custom system, and got recruited to build mobile games. And at the time, Unity was really the only option. Well, Unity or going native were the only options. Unreal hadn't got their mobile builds working yet. Yeah, because Unity was like a year ahead of everybody on that. And nobody else was really coming close. So I started with Unity, and I just really loved it. So before I'd done Unity stuff, I'd done a lot of C++ and a lot of C#, because I used to do a lot of MMO tools when I was working on games too. I'd do server code and tools. And I really liked C#, so when I found out I could build these games in Unity and C#, avoid some of the pain points that I'd hit with C++ all the time, I was kind of hooked. And then they've just made the engine better and better and better. So I've kind of fallen in love with it, and it's my favorite by far. I would say, if you're curious though, I did a whole, half-hour long video where I blabbed about why I like Unity so much though. I learned Python in a class and have begun to learn C# on my own. What are some things I probably learned in Python that will be useful information that transfers to C#? Because the idea of making public or private something confuses me, and classes seem completely different. It's a good question. My Python skills are totally terrible, so I don't know what Python stuff would necessarily translate. My Python is really, really, really bad. It's been a long time. I've written it a little bit for some lambdas, and that's about it. Other than that, like late 90s is the last time I really got into Python. Maybe it was early 2000s, somewhere around there. The public and private stuff, though, let me just talk about that and clarify it real quick. So when we have a public class, or let's say we have a class with a public method. Let's just show the code. Let's just write a little bit of code. Let's jump into writer, and let's show what public versus private means. Let's make a new class. So we're going to make an example class. I'm just going to move it to its own file real quick. Oh, Ben was asking about course links. Here, I think they're both linked at the bottom of that page, Ben. Okay, let's dive into the example. So we've got this public class called example, and it has a public void, which just means it doesn't return anything. Do a thing. So it's got this method that's going to do something. For now, it's just going to log did a thing. So a public method on here can be called by any other class outside of this. So say I've got a public class player guy. I probably have a player in here already, so just putting the word guy there. And I want him to do something with this example, right? So I've got this, let's say this is a mono behavior. All right, so this is a game object that's out there in my scene somewhere. And I'd say, hey, let's make our player guy a mono behavior too. because I think it makes the example easier. So in our awake, we go, hey, we want our example to do a thing. So we say find object of type, example. I'll put that into an example variable. So we've got example here. We're finding the example and putting it right here. That's just finding the instance of this class and assigning it to the variable. And then we say example dot do a thing. And this is just going to execute this code on our example. If we make this private, suddenly it's not accessible anymore. And the reason for that is we might have our example doing things that we don't want other classes to cause to happen, right? We don't want, like, we might have internal things that are going on with this object, right? Like, example is kind of a bad thing. Let's call this like NPC. Let's change this. I think using a slightly better, and we'll rename this NPC, and we'll call this like die. Let's do that. So say we've got our NPC can die, and we say, hey, we want, our player, when it does its awake, it can tell an NPC to die. Oh, let's replace that. We go, okay, that's fine, but maybe we don't want our player to necessarily be able to say, hey, this NPC should die. We just want him to tell the NPC to take damage, and we want the NPC to deal with whether or not it dies. So like this log say like I died, right? So instead what we would do is make this private, because we don't want our player to say, hey, kill this thing. And imagine this isn't awake, but this is like shoot the bad guy, right? Like or shoot and shoot. Oh, we'll just call it shoot. So they shoot, and we find the NPC and tell them to die. We don't want him to die, though. We want him to take damage. So what we would do is add a public method here. And maybe we would pass in some amount of damage, maybe not. We would say like health minus minus. So we're going to create a health field. This is just like an int, like we start off at 5 health. And then we'd say if health is less than or equal to 0, die. So what we're doing here is we're making sure that the player can only use the NPC in the way that we want. Only calling this take damage method, not calling the die method. So it can say take damage, and it can tell the player to take damage, but it can't actually kill them. I hope this makes sense. But that's essentially the reason that we use public versus private keywords on these things, so that we don't accidentally misuse things, and that we only make public the things that we want other classes to use, and we never make public anything that we don't want other classes to use. I don't know. Hopefully that clarifies things a little bit. Let's jump back over to questions and take a couple more, and then take a break because I'm getting really thirsty. What's the best program to create gear in MMOs? From simple to fancy, detailed, high fantasy. It can look really realistic quality. I have no idea. For like an actual tool to create it, I'm terrible as an artist, and I just leave that up to the artists. It's a good question, though. I'm kind of curious to know the answer, though, so I'm going to ask some and see if I can find out. Okay, how do you update yourself with technology and game engines and programming language, etc.? Or how do you keep updated? I constantly watch new videos on not just game programming, but just programming in general, clean code related stuff, all that kind of stuff. I'd say I watch 1 or 2 hours worth a day, just almost obsessively. I don't know that it's an easy thing to do, but I would say just do that. Another thing is talking to people. So I have weekly meetups where I talk to people and we ask each other questions. We run through things. They're a lot of fun. The architecture meetup that we do every Wednesday at 8 o'clock Pacific. You can find it on Meetup. Just search for Unity Architecture Meetup. And we just talk about stuff. We answer each other's questions and help. And I learn things from other developers, at places like that and at meetups. So it's been a little while since I got to go to some meetups, basically since I moved. So I'm trying to get back into those pretty soon, right? They're a good place to like learn about new things that you wouldn't think to ask about and to just talk to people. All right, next up. Good evening. Sorry about English. Don't worry about it. What to do in situations when the data structure begins to grow and contain not all the necessary fields. For example, a file of settings for weapons with typical fields, but due to homing missiles, the rotation speed field appears. Add this field to the structure, but then the guns all have it and will be... Oh, and it's only used by missiles. Yes. That seems like a good time to split things out and abstract them a bit. So your guns and your homing missiles probably should not be sharing a data structure. They should probably be sharing some perhaps some little bit of data, like a base structure for that data, maybe not even that, and they should share some interfaces on how they're used and how they're interacted with, but I wouldn't have them sharing the data themselves because, like you mentioned here, the data doesn't match, right? Like a gun's data is going to be quite a bit different from a homing missile's data. In fact, I would say the gun is closer to the launcher for the homing data or the homing missile than the actual missile itself. So it'd be closer to maybe sharing some data with a missile launcher, but not with the missile itself. That missile should, yeah, I'd say it should have its own separate data structure. And the same for, when you have different weapons. It's generally a bad idea to have unused fields in your data for your objects like this because it just leads to confusion and it leads to that bloat that you're seeing right there. So I'd split it off into its own data structure for these homing missile settings. Again, if you want to have a shared set of settings, you could have that as a second object on there, like a common settings or a base class for it. But I wouldn't share like having rotation speed on your guns. So I'd say, yeah, definitely just split it off into something separate, another data structure. Do you have any suggestions on how to prevent duping in MySQL? If you're talking about item duping, it's not really a thing that's database specific. The one thing I would avoid for items in an MMO. So for anybody that doesn't know, like MySQL is just a relational database. And say you've got a player who's got an item and they want to duplicate their item, right? They've got this magic sword and they want to make 2 swords of it. The easiest way to do it is to somehow trick the server into writing another insert into MySQL so that the item goes into another entry and you still have the item somewhere else. Like maybe you've got 2 entries of the item in the database. I say the easiest way, but I mean, that's kind of like the back end trick, what you're doing. All of the problem occurs in the server code, right? What happens is we do weird things like I've seen systems where you take an item out of your inventory. You literally click on it and it destroys that item in your inventory, creates a new item on your mouse cursor, and that item is not related to persistence at all. So unless your character has saved, you can do weird things with these items, like drop them, pass them around on the ground, trade them to people, and cancel out these trades. While like I think one of the first Vanguard dupes I found was you'd open up a trade, you'd put the item in the trade, you would hit the cancel button and then zone away at the exact same time. So the player would get a message saying, hey, add this item, and then it would persist that. I'm trying to remember the exact details now, but it would persist that item, and then you would get a second copy. I'm trying to remember where you get the second copy of the item. I think it was on the same player. So, oh, that's right. You would come across the zone and you would have the item on your cursor again. So you'd get the item on your cursor. Because it would bounce it back to your cursor, and it would put it back in your inventory because you'd zoned. So it would reload it from your inventory, but you'd still have this other copy on your cursor. You'd set that down, and suddenly you've got another valid instance of the item. So what I would generally avoid doing is in your game code, don't destroy and create items at all except for at load time or when the item actually needs to get created. Have a single spot for creating items. Don't do it kind of throughout your code. Don't have different parts of your code that are newing up or instantiating items. Only do it in one spot. And when you want to transition an item, don't do a database insert at all. Make sure that you're not doing a delete and an insert. Just do an update and change the owner of that item, and that's it. So that you don't end up running into these problems. These happen a lot with items because we just get loose and wild with the item creation code. You go, oh, hey, I need an item, but I need it over in this spot now, and I can't use that one, so I'll delete that one. I'll add one here. It turns into just a giant mess. So avoid recreating items at all costs and have a single factory, a single place where you do the item creation and be very strict about why that's called and when it's called. It should only be called when we actually want to add a new item to the world, not when we want to move an item around or put an item from one spot to another. Don't ever create items that way. It'll just cause problems. It'll cause dupes. It always causes dupes. Do you recommend any specific file types to store game data, such as XML, etc., for storing enemy, resource, and counter types? I'm currently writing my own as well as parsing methods. As well as my own parsing methods in hopes that I can make my game moddable and or extendable with updates and DLC. So I usually go with just JSON instead of XML just because it's more popular now and I think a little bit easier to read. But I also don't often store my data externally like that just because I find out that I have to then build in all these extra tools and I have to update those tools and keep them, I guess, up to date whenever we make changes to the game. So I generally don't store a lot of stuff in external files like that. Databases are another scenario though. So I do save a lot of stuff in databases for MMOs specifically because I want people to be able to see those changes immediately. I want multiple designers to be able to go in, work on something against a shared database, and then see each other's changes right away without having to send files back and forth or sync files or diff or merge or any of the other things that game designers hate and will struggle with and make you do for them. So just have them work directly into a database instead. For modding, you can also you can make it moddable with them going into Unity and creating mods too. It's not quite as simple to do, but it's definitely possible. But also storing out your data like that, I can see it depending on the type of game. Like it's very popular for RTS games, especially because then you can just go in, modify the tanks and the vehicles and stuff without having to know too much about the actual like engine or how anything works. You just kind of go in there and start changing data, and it just kind of works. So if you're going to do that though, I'd go with JSON files. If you're doing flat files, though. All right, let's go on. When is Pantheon releasing? Again, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. What should the roadmap for game development? It's kind of a broad question. So just make a plan for your game and start pushing forward and make sure that you're seeing measurable forward progress constantly. How do I start networking for getting an audience for my game? Start putting it out there. Just start showing people even way before it's ready, like long before it's ready when it looks like crap and you don't think anybody's going to be interested. Start getting feedback and start paying attention to that feedback. Don't just ignore the feedback. All right, can you give an example of all design patterns, how and where it's useful in an MMO? I don't think I can today because I'm running out of breath already and I don't know. There are a lot of different scenarios where different design patterns pop in. So it's a little too broad right now, though. Sorry. As a solo developer, should I stick with smaller games, e.g. 3-month projects, rather than my dream projects? Starting out, definitely. If you haven't done a bunch of 3-month projects, don't jump into the 1-year one. Do the 3-month ones first. Build up a little bit of practice and get used to creating things that you can then delete and destroy and learn from so that you're not coding yourself into a corner constantly. Just starting with your one big project is a good way to never finish your big project. Let's start with a couple small ones and then build up. If you've already done a bunch of small ones, then hey, jump into your dream project. But if you haven't done that yet, I'd go with a bunch of small ones first. Is Pantheon using dots? Not really. It's using some of the job system stuff. There's some dot stuff that may or may not get integrated in sometime soon. And we're definitely looking at it heavily for areas where there's a good performance benefit for it. It's definitely not built like dots from the foundation. Obviously, dots hasn't existed as long as the game, or at least hasn't been public as long as the game. And it doesn't, I don't think that we see a big benefit or reason to do a full conversion, but there are some areas where we can get huge performance benefits, and we're looking at those and trying to pull those in. How do you back up your projects? Git. I use Git for source control for just about everything, using something like source tree, like here, like this, source tree to just modify them or to manage them, Or on smaller projects, I'll use the collaborate system. If it's not a project that I'm sharing with other people, then I'll use collaborate. But generally, use Git. Some projects are still using SVN. I prefer Git generally, but they both work fine. But definitely use some source control. Don't use anything other than a source control system. Do all game world objects have a pub sub? For example, in area management, when entering an area, do the objects subscribe to a player and vice versa? That way you can fire events to the player or NPCs. No. So what they do instead in the area management, when you enter an area, you you get marked as being in that area, and then when you want to fire off an event, usually most of the time in MMOs, we're firing off events based on distance, and these distances can vary dramatically. Like my AOE like fire area around me radius could be dramatically different than my buff aura area around me, right? So they could all be totally different ranges. So what we'll do is call into the area management system and say, hey, give me all of the things matching these criteria in this range. Or sometimes it's just give me all of the things, all of the NPCs 3 meters away or less from this specific point. And then we'll go through those guys and process each of them, or have them go, we'll take that set of data, those NPCs, and then run whatever we need against them. The quad tree is a good way of getting that data faster so that we can, I guess, manage a bunch of entities in an area, and shrink those areas down. Because if we have a giant grid, so say we do that and we don't have any area management system, then we're looping over every NPC doing a distance check, right? If we have just a 3x3 grid where we've cut the world into 9 pieces, right? Like a tic-tac-toe board, and we only check against the ones in your current area, then we've cut it down to maybe as low as a ninth. But we have another problem where, hey, if we're right on the edge of one area or we're on the edge of another area, we might not be checking. So then we'll end up checking the 9 around or the 8 around you as well. So usually it'll be like a 20x20 grid, and we're just checking the ones around you in the number of cells over to meet our distance check. So if our cells are 100 meters wide and our thing is only a 20 meter distance, we know we only need to check the one cell that you're in and the cells around you. And then we can go to a quad tree to speed this up dramatically, or an octree if we need to go 3-dimensional. But a lot of the time, just that grid and then checking the things in your cell and your cells around, or maybe multiple cells around if we have to go a bigger area, is an easy way to optimize that and not have to check against hundreds or thousands of things, but only check against a dozen or so. Great content. Would you list some possible difficulties that could arise when creating an RTS game on WebGL? Ooh, latency, performance, design choices, etc. I don't think I could. I think there are going to be a lot of difficulties creating an RTS for WebGL, but I don't have enough WebGL practical experience to know exactly what those are. I mean, creating an RTS alone that's not in WebGL, that's a real RTS, is a big thing. Creating one for 30 to 200 players, I'd say, is a much bigger thing. It's a big problem, or a lot of work. And then doing it for WebGL is just going to add even more. I wish I could give some better advice there. I don't have enough experience building RTSs or WebGL games to really speak to it, though. Where should a noob learn to start to learn networking / multiplayer for an MMO? I'd grab like that MMORPG asset pack and start looking at that. I think it's a good example of how MMOs get built. It's obviously no example is going to be perfect, but it's a pretty good example of showing a lot of the different systems and how things need to interact, and that whole process of sending messages down from the client to the server. And it gives you a good starting point to start building things out, trying things out. I would go there first. What's the best way of building a good game architecture? Thinking about everything before starting the project or adding things as it goes? I actually really like this question because I've changed my mind on this. I had to take a drink there. So a lot of the time people think that what you need to do before starting a project is figure out everything that you're going to do, design all of that, design the architecture for the entire thing, block it up, build up these big diagrams, just decide on your database, decide on as many things as possible, right? Make as many decisions as possible before you start coding, so that way you're coding the right thing. This always goes wrong. I've never once seen it go well. It always turns into, well, project failure or project delays, and messes. Because realistically, when we're building this game or we're building any game, especially something big, if we try to guess everything that we're going to need and how we're going to want to do things and how we're going to want to tie things up way in advance, we're going to make mistakes. And because we've got this thing written down in blocks, we're going to enforce those mistakes. And we're going to end up with, I'd say, a lot more problems. We're going to end up over engineering things in a way that doesn't make sense and makes our game harder to build, harder to finish, and definitely harder to test. Instead, I like to keep it relatively simple, have a good overall idea of the things that we want and the key important parts. Like if we're using something like Houdini, let's think about it right away, right? Like let's get that into our head and start thinking about how that's going to interact, because it could have some implications. If we're building an MMO with a network system, let's think about what that networking system looks like and how we're going to abstract away from it. But other than that, I'm much more a fan of building our architecture up somewhat organically, as long as we're paying attention to it and not just letting it grow into some random thing. So I'd say keeping it tested and testable is number one, like making sure that the code that we're writing is under unit tests and that it's actually testable. And it's really hard to do that when we've predefined how everything's going to look and we've predefined these seams in probably wrong spots. And I feel like creating this like big block of architecture a lot of time will give a false sense of security. Like, oh, okay, it's gonna be fine. It's gonna be just like this. We don't have to worry about it. And oh, look at that in chat. Yep. Just remember, it will probably change. Because he's saying that pre-planning is good, but it gets you. But when I guess yeah, part of it is that when you start thinking about it and planning out everything in this one way in your head, the project is going to make changes. It's not going to be exactly what you thought from the start. And this is way more the case with games than anything else I've ever built. A lot of the time with the software system, you have a good idea of almost exactly what it needs to do. With a game, it has to be fun, and it's very hard to predict fun. So it's going to change dramatically. So if you designed this architecture for things, it's going to be wrong. It's going to be wrong every single time, and it's going to need to be adapted. So I'd say much more important than thinking about everything before starting the project is when you're writing your code, think about it being unit testable. Think about like, can this be tested? Is this testable? And why am I not just writing tests for it right now? And if you follow that, it's going to be a whole lot easier than if you just try to pre-design out an architecture and work from there. Again, a good idea of some of the fundamentals and things that you want to do are good, but you should ideally be comfortable enough with these patterns and generally with design patterns when you're building a big game that you can see how things just kind of fit in and slide in as you're building the project up and not have to pre-decide too much of that. I'm going to go on. I feel like I'm just kind of saying the same thing. Do you think MMOs have any significant improvements in narrative moving forward? Maybe. The problem with narrative in MMOs is that there are so many other players in there, so many other things going on. Telling a single cohesive story in a way that's really compelling without breaking them away from all the other players can be very difficult. There's nothing really technical stopping people from doing it other than players, right? Like other people are your biggest issue when you're dealing with trying to tell a narrative in an MMO, because you could have this whole story going on and then some guy runs around taking his pants on and off and jumping up and down in front of everything, and I don't know, or just runs up and trains and kills everything. It can be very difficult to get that across, but there's nothing really stopping it. I don't know, and I think, to be honest, I think that every MMO designer thinks that they're telling amazing, great narrative. It's probably mostly because it's all in their head and they have this giant cool story in their head, but what comes out to players tends to be, a lot less of that. I mean, I remember looking at the stats on EQ2, ran some stats against the quest stuff to see, like, hey, are people reading quests? Like, are they actually going through the quest dialogue and reading it and seeing all this stuff? Like, we've got these pages after pages and pages of text here, like saying, hey, these guys did this and we want you to go do this thing because of this reason. And the answer was a big fat no, right? Like, I think it was less than 5% were spending a second on the screen, and like less than 1% were actually reading the actual text. So, these designers are writing up all these long, cool, interesting stories. There's so much of it though, and the world was so overwhelmed with it that nobody cared. Nobody read it, right? Well, I say nobody, but like 1% of people. And if you have a big chunk of your team working on stuff that only 1% of your player base cares about or reads, and that's probably going to end up getting, scaled back or cut or changed. And I think that ended up happening too. I think they made some adjustments after they realized that and stopped writing so much long text. And I think that's probably the case for every MMO out there, right? If you think about them, you play them, you click next, you hit the thing, because you can only care about so many of these stories. And when there's so much of this stuff in there, it just gets overwhelming and really just kind of pointless. Like, it doesn't matter why you want me to kill these 20 rats. I just know that you want me to kill these 20 rats and I'm going to get a thing. All right, how to get downloads for my game? I have no idea. I made an Android game and I feel like you'll like it. Bomber Brigade made interesting visuals to attract people, but I'm not getting downloads. Well, let's search for it and show it, and maybe everybody on the stream can go check it out. Let's search for Bomber Brigade Android. I have no idea. Tip 1, I'd say come up with a name that shows up on the Play Store when we search. Maybe rebrand it a little bit so that it's, I don't know. Unless it's this one that's just showing up as like maybe it is this, but I'm not sure. I would get it onto the Android store if it's not on there. I'm going to jump to the next one though. But if that is it, then yeah, everybody go check it out. I'm terrible at marketing and selling games, so I really couldn't tell you. Do you/professionals keep updating Unity while in development, or do you recommend we lock into an LTS version? Yes, I keep updating constantly. I would lock into an LTS maybe 3 to 6 months before launching if it's a big project. And even then, I'd consider constantly upgrading. Just because I don't like falling behind on versions, and doing big version updates is a giant nightmare. So I like to update as fast as possible. I typically have ideas that I really love, but after a few weeks, I spiral into all the reasons I shouldn't work on that project anymore. Do you have any tips for avoiding that or getting out of that mentality? Sharing your project. Number one thing. Get it out there, get feedback, get people playing it, get people asking you. Showing up to things where you're sharing your project and seeing that people are interested in it, right? Sometimes, you'll start building something and realize that you shouldn't work on it, and it's the right decision to stop working on it. Don't just keep working on it because you're working on it. But a lot of the time it can also just get demotivating because nobody's seeing your thing. You're working kind of on your own in the corner, and you really need to get people looking at your stuff and giving you feedback, playing it. And I think it can really encourage you, especially if you have like a weekly mastermind group type thing where you're showing up and talking about your progress and asking questions and chatting with people about it. It can be super motivating. So look for something like that as an alternative too. Where would I be able to learn programming patterns? I did a whole series on game programming patterns on my YouTube channel and the solid principles, and I'm going to do another one on solid principles soon. I would look at the game programming patterns one though, and also the game programming patterns book. It's a really good one. And it's free online, or you just grab it on Amazon. How do I manage the feeling of imposter syndrome? I'm currently a final year CS student, and I regularly find myself feeling intimidated when starting a new module of study, or even trying to do something I would enjoy. Currently trying to build a new game. I'm comfortable with coding, a fair amount of experience, but still feel out of my depth. I think everybody does. Really, I've met very few people who don't feel this way forever. You just have to remember that everybody has this same situation, right? Well, not everybody. Sometimes people get overconfident. Usually it's a couple years after the point that you're at, and you get overconfident and just kind of feel like you know everything and nobody else knows what they're talking about, and you're going to do it the easy way and you got it down, and then, again, start to realize the things you don't know, and imposter syndrome kicks back in. It happens for everyone. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just know that every time you talk to people, like, they don't know everything. Like, they know the things that they tell you they know, and that's it. Like, don't assume that everybody knows the answer to everything, or that everybody even knows everything that you know. Even as a CS student, you're going to know a lot of things that people who are building games now may or may not know. Especially as a CS student, when it comes to things like algorithms and optimizations, you may know a lot of things that other people who didn't go through that process might not know. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. And the bigger thing is, when you start to work on something and you feel overwhelmed or intimidated, just slow down and start researching that thing. A lot of the time, these things that seem crazy and complex are actually much simpler than they are. We just have a lot of crazy terminology and weird little things that you have to know to make them make sense. So I'd say just start investigating and learning about those things. You'll find that most of the things that feel scary and overwhelming aren't too bad once you boil them down. Any general advice for VR game development? Other than targeting the Quest now, because it seems like it's going to take over the entire ecosystem. Not a whole lot. For locomotion in VR, the biggest things are more design related, where you don't want to accelerate or decelerate players at all, because it tends to make them sick. And if you can use a vignette or something to bring in the view when they're moving, if you're moving them along a line, it tends to help a lot. Also, rotating players tends to make them sick. So just try not to rotate them unnaturally, or do it in more of a blink action. That's about it. Some people are fine with it, though. I also test it a lot with actual different people. Don't test with just yourself and your other co-developers. Any programming patterns accepted as good practice that you disagree with or avoid? I can't think of anything. No, not that's something I would consider accepted as good practice and I disagree with or avoid it. It used to be unit testing, but now I'm 100% on board with that too. What do you think about scriptable objects for maintaining game code, referring to Round Bear Games tutorial, or should we follow design patterns? I'm just not a big fan of it. I understand the value of it. This is that whole idea of essentially making your games through a scriptable object system that essentially makes it into more of a visual scripting system. I think that realistically, once the visual scripting system comes, the use for this is possibly going to die up completely. And I think that if you're not building a lot of very similar games, it's more building a platform here that's not going to be very useful for you. So if you're building a lot of similar games, like you're building, a dozen card games, or you're building Solitaire version number 70, these things can come in very handy, right? Because you're just doing the same thing over and over, same team of designers working on it, and they're just making these little modifications. If you're building up a new game, though, building this whole extra layer to manage game state, I'm not a big fan of it. I feel like it makes things more complicated and harder for code to deal with than, and all at the benefit of trying to make it easier for design, but design's not going to be customizing these things, especially if you're in an MMO. I really like your video. What are your favorite game development YouTube channels? I don't know. I like a lot of them. I kind of bounce through a lot of them. Psycho one's good. I obviously would like the Brackies ones. I just find like interesting things there. Let's see. Thomas Brush has some good stuff. Sebastian's. What else? But I guess the other thing, Charles Infallible Code. I love watching his stuff. He always cracks me up, especially when he talks to himself. It's interesting stuff. But I also like to watch a lot of non-game development stuff too. I feel like if you just watch game development tutorials, you'll learn a lot, but you're not going to learn some of the more fundamental stuff and some of the things that help with longer term projects. You can learn a lot of very in-depth stuff on how to build a specific system or specific controller. But when it comes to bigger architectural stuff, I really like watching things like Uncle Bob videos, or just other old guy programmers who talk about keeping things clean and interesting and being responsible with code. I find those really interesting too. What are your thoughts on Unity deprecating some features before replacements are available? Unet, for example. Obviously, it doesn't work. Whole company doesn't work on the same project, but it seems strange to deprecate the current solution without a working replacement. Yep, and I think that's why they kind of pushed back on it. Like they tried to remove it completely and then decided to put it back in. I think that for the Unet situation, they know that mirror is available and works and is an option that people can transition to. So I think that they're less concerned about it, and I think that they realize there are just some fundamental issues with Unet, so they want to try to minimize people getting into these things that they're trying to replace and remove. I don't think that it's been too much of an issue outside of Unet, though. That was kind of the biggest one where it really was kind of a problem and had some pushback. So I don't worry about it too much. I like that they're going to packages, the package manager for stuff. I think it's a lot easier. The description should have the link to the questions form, but I'm going to wrap this up in, I don't know, the next 7 minutes by 2 o'clock. Do you use Scrum or Kanban for solo/personal projects? Do you try to keep time boxes like 2-week sprints if you do? I use Trello for them, and I generally don't use sprints. I just constantly am going on things. Especially for personal and solo projects, I don't have anybody to report to or timeline to follow for other people, so I don't really worry about sprints or timelines on those. I just know what the next most important thing is, and I jump to that and I just continue on. Any opinion on Jonathan Blow's JAI programming language? I have not seen it, but I am very curious to check it out. Interesting. Well, let's see. So I don't have any yet, but I'm going to have to read through this and see. I don't want to read this whole thing and try to figure it out live on a stream. There's a couple more questions, but I am kind of curious about it. I'd love to check it out. Seems interesting. It's definitely something worth reading. And this is the kind of thing that I like to do too. Just go through and read random stuff that people post about or write about and see what kinds of interesting little bits I can pull from there and how I can integrate them into other projects. How early in development do you start building custom tools? As soon as they're needed. So as soon as I think it's tedious to do, make a tool around it. If I have to get into a database or an Excel sheet and start adding things multiple times, and I've done it 2 or 3 times, it's time to build a tool and automate it. I'd say anything that you've done a couple times and it's not super simple, or you're going to have to keep doing it constantly, and try to automate it as much as possible and then build tooling around it to make it as simple as possible if I can't completely automate it away. What could I use OpenGL for if I was to learn it? Building your own game engines or working in places that are using custom engines that use OpenGL. You're going to need to be pretty good at it though and learn a lot about rendering pipelines and stuff. So it's an interesting thing to learn though. Something I used to know and now I don't remember any of it. Character controller or rigid body for a 3D first-person game. Generally, I'd start with a character controller and then switch over to a rigid body and a custom character controller later on. Once you're getting into the part where the basic character controller isn't meeting the needs, then you switch over and start writing your own. Again, working on a lot of the core fundamentals of the game and get all that down and then start working on the custom stuff that you need to really make the character controller better. And how you do that character controller for your first person game is going to depend a lot on your game. So I like to build out a lot of that game, figure out what kind of functionality it's going to need before I try to build the character controller, because if I build a custom one and then I build the game and they don't match up right, then I'm going back and constantly changing it and changing assumptions that I've made on my character controller, when I can just delay those decisions until later. I think the term that Bob Martin used was delaying decisions until, what did he say? The last reasonable opportunity to make them. So deciding on how to do things at the last reasonable opportunity to do them. This goes kind of back to that whole architectural question on should you pre-decide and predefine your entire architecture. The whole goal is to delay these decisions as long as possible. I think in one of the examples he used, he was talking about building this wiki system where they initially thought they needed to use MySQL, right? He's like, okay, well, we'll have to put MySQL in. And then they just go, well, let's wait. Let's just do it later. Let's delay it and let's do something else first. They just do some flat files, and they did that first. And then they just continued to keep delaying decisions, eventually decided, hey, we didn't actually even need a database for the system and we were overcomplicating it, right? So it's just, again, that delaying. So I would say start with character controller and then move up to the custom one with a rigid body once you get to that need. What's the best way to maintain code? Unit tests, by far. Unit testing and writing testable code will keep it much more maintainable, and you'll know when things break, and you just won't break things. You'll know immediately when things break and know why they broke and be able to fix them. I find it difficult to design and conceive small 2 to 3 month projects and end up feature creeping myself and scrapping everything. Yep, everybody does this. Any idea on how to change this mentality, as I cannot come up with small designs to make, and I feel like it really holds me back. You just got to practice saying no, right? Like, stop adding things. It's very, very easy to go, hey, somebody had an idea. That's a cool idea. Let's put it in. That's a cool idea. Let's put it in. And a lot of the time, it's you having the idea. You just have to resist the urge. Keep the game as, like, just think about every time you're adding in a feature. Think like, does this really change the core gameplay in a way that's fundamental and is going to make more people play it? 99% of the time, the answer is no. It's just a neat feature that you saw in another game that you thought would be fun to add in. How to change the mentality part, I don't know, really. Just, you got to just force yourself to stop adding in new things and just realize that most features that you add aren't going to have any impact on the game or are going to have a negative impact. Over adding features is a good way to destroy or even just prevent a game from shipping. Have you thought about doing any videos on editor scripting in Unity? A little. I've done a couple in the past. I'll probably do some more. I'm waiting for the new UI system, though, because that's going to change things quite a bit, and I want to see what it looks like there. I need to learn Python for AAA size MMO or even C++, or is Unity enough? You definitely don't need Python for it. I don't know of any that are built in Python. There might be some. Most are in C++, and there are some done in Unity. The one that we're building right now is in Unity. There's no real reason you can't build one in Unity, just the ones that are out there right now aren't, right? I would say that a while ago, building one in Unity probably would have been very, very difficult and maybe a little crazy. Now I'd say it's a very good, easy choice to make. I'd go with Unity for building an MMO. But if you want to work on existing MMOs too, C++ and learning Unreal can be a good benefit. Most of the MMOs are built in custom stuff. Most aren't built in Unreal or Unity. There's their own custom engines that are developed in-house. But I'd say a lot of that's changing, and Unity and Unreal are probably the two biggest choices going forward for new games getting built that are MMOs. Although I'm not sure I know all the stats on that, but I think if you looked, most of them are going to be in one of those two now. You're very welcome for answering the questions. How to learn good coding practices? Just practice. Watch lots of videos. Take some courses. Watch more videos. And practice building games. Also, pair programming. Work with other people. It's a great way to learn. Especially you pair program or mob program. It's good stuff. All right, I think I'm going to wrap it up here because I'm getting super thirsty and been talking for a really long time. Got a bunch of stuff I got to get done today. But if you guys don't mind just hitting the like button and sharing after, I'd really appreciate it. The better these do, the more likely I am to just do them more often. And maybe we'll kick off another one of these sometime later on this week. So if you got questions, just be ready and watching, and I'll post when it's up. Thanks again, everybody.